the avid audience, Anekdhara's mainstay, our revered advisors, experts providing a breath of fresh air to our audience, the technical team headed by Mr. Sadiq and many others. Good morning. Anekdhara, as you all nurture and as you all know well, is a public policy portal founded by a group of retired civil servants with a hope to bring better sanity to the current public debate. As humans contemplating and contesting binaries like right, wrong, good, bad, etc., the world moved far ahead in synthesis too. From Yajnavalkya threatening Gargi to break her head into pieces for too much questioning, our women anchors and panelists silencing both sagely and senseless men alike, the world came a long way. Yet, dogmatists blasting Gauri Lankesh's heart of liberty into smithereens surprise us. Has the intolerant world really moved ahead? When we juxtapose Socrates' Hamlet for speaking truth and racketeers, rapists, and religious rogues given remission for reasons of power, pelf, and politics, one wonders whether we really moved ahead. From Dharmashastra's decrees of Shudra's tongue to be cut for reciting Veda, to the untouchable Ambedkar giving the new law of liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice, we appear to have moved from hell to heaven. Yet, when a Hindu Dalit man killed for entering a Hindu temple, our numbed senses groan. Are we human enough? Our chests swell with pride, seeing the voluminous Constituent Assembly debates deck our library desks, but our hearts sink in cynicism as the same temple of democracy is shaken with the hateful shouts of lawless leaders. It is the seesawing of liberal, illiberal imbroglio our experts will try to untangle, I suppose. Our first speaker is Dr. Ajay Gudavarthy. Completing BA Honours from Delhi University, Dr. Ajay did his PG, MPhil, and PhD at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. After brief stints at National University of Judicial Sciences, Kolkata, National Law School of India University, Bengaluru, Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bengaluru, Dr. Ajay has been with the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, as Associate Professor from 2006. His passion for human rights and human equality pushed him to develop intensive and extensive relations with every organization and every journal concerning human rights. He published and co-published hundreds of articles, attending hundreds of seminars, conferences, and symposiums. He edited and co-authored many, more than 8 books, and all received high praise. While undertaking more than half a dozen research projects, Dr. Ajay has more than a dozen awards and fellowships to his academic kit. We are privileged, sir, to have you in our midst, and the podium now is yours, Dr. Ajay.
Thank you. Am I audible? Thanking my friends and colleagues at Anekdhara, and special thanks, of course, to Mr. Gagarin Garu, because we have known Gagarin Garu since our childhood. He was our household. Some reference to Mr. Gagarin was inevitable, not only in my family, but extended family. I don't know how many times he was troubled for going out of his way to help with our travel plans. I think we wouldn't have seen half of India without Mr. Gagarin's help. At some point or other, he pitched in to help us in a very generous way. Also, let me thank Snigdhendu for spontaneously agreeing and joining us today in this discussion. So, coming to today's topic, that whether India is becoming illiberal. On one hand, I think many of us would very readily agree that there is something going wrong with democracies across globe. The democracies are turning increasingly illiberal. They are becoming soft authoritarian. They are becoming ethnic democracies. These have been some of the categories that scholars have used to explain that democracies are increasingly becoming majoritarian and very ethnic in their character. But the question I would raise with you is two types of questions. One, can all that is going on, both in its, especially in its social and cultural dynamics, can we explain all of that through the category of illiberality? So being non-liberal or anti-liberal or illiberal, does it really explain what is going on across globe? Second, even if one concedes the point that let's assume much of it that we're witnessing across globe is indeed illiberality, and that illiberality is not good for healthy and open societies, as Popper would say, for functioning democracies, we still need to raise the question that why are people consenting to this kind of illiberality? Even whatever degree, people might vary what is the depth and the range and the scale of this consent, but one can comfortably conclude that there is some degree of social political consent to this form of governance that looks illiberal. So we need to answer both these questions. Is this all illiberality? And even if it is illiberality, what can possibly explain this consent to illiberality? I will offer you 5 provisional explanation, and I'm seeing this more as a dialogue rather than a monologue, that I'm going to raise 5 tentative hypotheses that I draw in order to explain whether this is illiberality, and if so, why this consent. So my first reasoning is that we need to go back to that there is a centrality of culture in democracies, which perhaps we have not witnessed so far, at least in post-colonial democracy, the kind of centrality that cultural identities, religious identities are especially the religious confessional majoritarian ethos is the way it is showing up, because much of political scientists like Rudolphs and others thought that since we are a caste divided society, caste is a natural check on a confessional majority. But today we are finding that caste need not necessarily be, or caste differences, even caste discrimination need not necessarily be a hindrance for the emergence of a confessional majority. And this, I think, is a very telling point about modern democracies. Since Mr. Gagarin was quoting liberty, equality, and fraternity, since modern democracies are based on those sensibilities of liberty and equality, how do we explain the fact that notwithstanding caste hierarchies and caste discriminations, India is emerging as a confessional majority state? There seems to be some kind of an irresistible attraction to be part of Hindu identity, to be recognized in terms of this religious and partly civilizational identity. I think this needs some explanation, that this identification, this urge to identify in terms of this kind of a religious civilizational can come from somewhere else. I mean, and whether that identification itself, is it necessarily an illiberal sentiment? That is the question I'm posing for friends at Anekdhara, that can we therefore separate that the urge to identify could emerge from somewhere else, and that urge is in turn being converted into some kind of a majoritarian, authoritarian statecraft, which could be a separate process, which need not be organically necessarily collapsed with this sense of identification with the religious and civilizational identity. Here I would draw your attention to a very interesting book by Mr. David Goodhart, writing in the context of UK. The title of the book is Road to Somewhere, where he makes a very interesting thesis that in today's world, unlike the world of the 1950s, when class was the primary dividing factor, economic development was a primary dividing factor, which explained the difference between classes within nations and which explained the difference between nations. So global north and global south, core and periphery, these are some of the categories some of you would be conversant with, is how we explain the social and economic divides in the world. But David Goodhart says that post the turn of the century, economic divide have been replaced by a new cultural divide, which is what he refers to as a divide between somewheres and anywheres. Somewheres are those who are territorially bound, who are culturally rooted, who look at social life as a way of life, who look at social and political developments through the cultural prism in terms of their ascriptive identities they are born into. It could be ethnic identity, it could be racial identity, it could be caste identity, or it could be religious identity. And therefore, they look at life in terms of a very close interpersonal cultural networks. In fact, he gives a very interesting statistics that even in an advanced capitalist country like United Kingdom, 62% of people do not prefer to move beyond the radius of 20 miles from the place where they are born and where they got their initial education. That is, people still want to be connected territorially and therefore have a very provincial outlook. And if some of you have visited Europe and especially North America, you can see beyond the metropolitans of New York or London. In fact, much of Europe and North America is very, very provincial and very, very inward looking, that they cling on to their Welsh, Scottish identities, and they're not really global the way we think Europe is. The other identity which he says the divide is between somewheres who are territorial, culturally located, and the other identity is that of anywheres. That this is the tiny elite, cosmopolitan elite. Maybe many of us who are part of this conversation may belong to this kind of a cosmopolitan elite, which is comfortable with some kind of intercultural mixing, which speaks in the context of modern rationality, modern reason, talks in the registers of constitutionalism. So generally has a modernist outlook to social life, where we are comfortable with multiple cultures, comfortable with multiple lifestyles, food habits, clothing, inter-religious marriages, so on and so forth. And therefore, he says today's biggest conflict across the globe is that this idea of the liberal idea of the cosmopolitanism in terms of an open-ended, trans-border kind of a global outlook has got restricted to a very tiny social elites. While majority of population, a majority of social groups continue to live a very provincial life, a very culturally rooted life, and that culturally rooted life, modernity in one sense, distorts that culturally rooted life and produces more chauvinistic, inward-looking kind of an outlook. So it is the overreach, the point that David Woodard is making, it is the overreach of the cosmopolitan gaze, a moralistic take on provincial life that makes provincialism very chauvinistic and inward-looking, and perhaps part of the reason that why today much of India is responding the way it does when it comes to confessional majoritarian religious politics, that they begin to kind of support or lend their consent to authoritarian regimes. So there is this distortion, and therefore my question is that we need to no, it would therefore not complete or sufficient to simply have moral critique of this illiberality. This illiberality is born from this divide between somewheres and anywheres, and therefore I think we need to have a more sustained debate in terms of the limits of liberal cosmopolitanism in its ability to make societies open-ended, so on and so forth. I'll leave it there. There is more to it, but I will quickly, since we have limited time, I'll quickly run through my 5 points and then open it up for discussion. The second important reason I find there is this aggressive occupation of public spaces, masculine demonstration, support for strongmen phenomena, support for muscular nationalism that is aggressive and potentially very violent, and at times also can be genocidal, emerges in my mind due to my second formulation, which is that a deep kind of a chasm, a deep anomaly that democracy has produced in the last 50 years, but perhaps 100 years in Europe, but 50 odd years in post-colonial democracies. That is an unevenness between the processes of social democratization and growing economic inequalities. So my broad argument is that democracies in post-colonial societies have been successful, mostly in terms of bringing in a certain imagination of social democratization. Today, that there is a social democratic imagination of civility, of mutuality, of dignity. That today I think all castes, till the last caste in the pecking order, gender, religious minorities, ethnic groups, nationalities in Northeast, I think there is a fundamentally democratic imagination that how they wish to be treated. There can be no justification of hierarchy any longer. There cannot be a justification of discrimination. There cannot be in terms of uncivility, so on and so forth. Though we routinely witness these incidents, but I think there is a democratic consensus that this uncivility has no place in modern democracies. So there has been a social processes of social democratization in terms of imagination, I think has deepened over in the last 50 years. And this I find, has multiple reasons as to why there is this kind of social democratization. One obvious is the technology, reach of social media. You can see through social media, I think it creates some sense of virtual equality in platform where everybody has access to information, has access to global processes, so on and so forth. If you look at the fashion trends, for instance, is a good place to go. People are very conversant with very modern. I drive from my university, from my place to university. In between, I drive through a small kind of a ghetto shanty place of low middle class habitation. But when I see the young kids walking out of those bylanes, they're all wearing low-waist jeans. They're carrying look-alike Gucci bags. So I can see that their class is not an impediment to their awareness to social trends in terms of contemporary fashion, so on. So this is an example I'm giving how social democratization in terms of imagination of equality, in terms of access to information, I think we have able to successfully achieve. Second, obviously, is market. Consumption has become the new modality to find processes of realizing, processes of self, process of recognition and dignity. And this and patterns of consumption themselves have undergone a massive change. David Harvey, an interesting geographer, came up with this formulation that under modern financial capitalism, he refers to non-exclusionary consumption. He gives a good example of Netflix as this idea of non-exclusionary consumption, where one person consuming the good does not exclude others from consuming it simultaneously. So multiple people can consume the Netflix simultaneously, and therefore one person consuming does not mean it creates scarcity for other people, like all other perishable goods do. Therefore, this non-exclusionary consumption has itself created a certain kind of an equalization of access in terms of consumption patterns. Third, I think very important reason is spread of education. That today there is a greater spread of higher education, primary education, certainly in most parts of India, even globally. David Goodhart gives statistics. In Europe, it has reached 90%, but in India now, statistics tell us that access to higher education has crossed 60%. There are many people who are getting primary education has spread vastly. There are new demands for English education, so on and so forth. I think education, spread of higher education also obviously distills a sense of new democratic consciousness. And fourth reason for this social democratization is, of course, democracy. That democracy comes with this value of one person, one vote, one value. I think whatever might be other things on the day of the voting, that your moral worth and your value equals any rich person. And that equalization also, I think, pushes in a certain kind of democratic consciousness. However, these processes of social democratization are at variance with neoliberalism, or at variance with growing economic inequalities. All statistics, whether you take Piketty, whether you take our own economist, Prabhat Patnaik, Jaydeep, all of them consistently demonstrated to data that economic inequalities, including in a country like China, have multiplied many times in terms of absolute inequalities post neoliberalism in India post 1990s. And therefore, there is a steady shrinking of economic opportunities, steady pushing of people into informal sector. Look at India has 90% informal labor in the informal sector, and disorganized labor without basic social security. without basic access to basic amenities, so on and so forth. So you can imagine this shrinking economic opportunities are pitched against growing democratic social democratization. And democracy itself deepens this chasm. The democratic mobilization, electoral mobilizations, I think, heighten this chasm by projecting new aspirations, asking people for greater demands, greater aspirations, greater political mobilization, but with shrinking economic opportunities. And I feel that what we are referring to as illiberality has its deep roots in this unevenness, that people are struggling with basic necessities. They are being dispossessed. Financial capitalism has moved from exploitation to appropriation. There is a great degree of primitive accumulation going on in India. We know the entire debate on land acquisition, the crisis in central India. There's a great amount of displacement, growing distress, migration. So you can see that on the economic front, there is one great economic distress that is being growing. And on the social front, there is an increasing language and mobilization around the axis of social democratization. I think it is this anomaly that is producing a certain justification for aggression in public posturing. Every religion, caste, gender, ethnicity, the political subjectivity of these groups today is that they all feel that unless they are aggressive in projecting their demands, unless they flout institutional norms, unless they flout rule of law, they will not be heard. And of course, current regime is actively encouraging this kind of. But the roots of this political character and political aggression is based on formation of an aspirational self, an aspirational imagination. When people talk about speed and scale of development, without the benefits of development being in any sense equal, in any sense accessible, even with the basic liberal principle of equality of opportunity. I think this anomaly produces a great amount of aggression, and that aggression is seen as a necessary form of demonstrating political subjectivity for pushing even basic demands. So that then, of course, comes across for us when we watch the phenomena at a distance as illiberality. Therefore, if we simply condemn all of this as being illiberal, what will happen without understanding the processes that are driving this illiberality on the ground, then we might actually willy-nilly be adding to that process of illiberality. My third reason is that globally there is a big shift, and in my own recent book, Politics, Ethics and Emotions, Snigdhendu would know because he has just reviewed the book. In New India, I argue that 20th century was a century of which we refer to as age of revolutions. It was a century of political upheavals. It was an age of technological innovation, so on and so forth. But 21st century, I refer to as age of emotions. That human collectives across globe are struggling not with modern technology, coping with the speed, all of that exists. But I think that the core of it, what all of that has translated into, is that there is an explosion of and a certain public sanction and legitimacy of expressing emotions in public domain. The classical liberalism, if you read somebody like a philosopher like Martha Nussbaum in her book Political Emotions, she argues that liberalism draws this divide, that it pushes your personal values, ethics, emotions into the private domain. And in the public, it only has sanctions for secular, associational behavior in contractual relations through legal identity, so on and so forth. There is this big, I think, since we are speaking to a set of civil servants, they would know this divide very clearly, that how bureaucracy is based on a legal, rational behavior, while subjective preferences, subjective emotions, gut feelings, intuition, all that constitutes being human being, were pushed to reduce, like what Weber would argue, were pushed into the personal domain. Today, this crisis, this divide between the public and the private, that was at the heart of liberalism, to produce a secular state structure, to produce constitutional states, to produce discourses of liberty, so on and so forth, is in deep crisis. it is no longer able to hold that divide together. And what we have is like a dam breaking. This divide between the public and private today stands broken down. That we have the gush of the private into the public. There is a new imagination globally that is demanding a more public space and a public sanction for a legitimate recognition of private emotions in the public space. I mean, some of you would recollect Trump's the great locker room conversation. When that locker room conversation broke open, many people thought that Americans would outright reject Trump because it was such an unsavory conversation. But we know how America voted after they heard this. But therefore, there is a new sanction. The very idea of authenticity today people are gauging in terms of demonstration of emotion. Therefore, you would see all strongmen, all demagogues are attuned to this public demonstration of emotion. I did not refer to examples in the Indian context. We are all very familiar of this repeated demonstration of deep, personal, intimate, emotional, inner emotions is an outright demonstration in the public domain. Therefore, there is the intimate has come to the public. State is no longer a soulless machine, as Gandhi would say. It's no longer that indifferent, distant entity, but it's a very intimate entity. It is a very paternalistic entity. Therefore, some scholars have referred to what we are currently undergoing as libertarian paternalism. That on the one hand, you have free market, and then you have a very paternalistic state that bestows interest in your everyday life. If you look at, for instance, a quick example that comes to my mind is Man Ki Baat. That look at the issues that the Prime Minister deals with in Man Ki Baat. These are very routine, banal, everyday issues of how to take exams, how to take care of your health, what to do when it is very hot outside, how to face a harsh summer, how to face a harsh winter. These are the issues that he discusses in Man Ki Baat, which is to say that there is a very anomalous combination of ruthless strongmen with an intimate self, which draws its legitimate sanction from this demonstration of emotions in the public domain. And there is this lid that liberalism and liberal constitutional states through the bureaucratic apparatus put a lid on the legitimacy of public expression of emotions. Therefore, the entire global discourse, in a sense, has shifted from legal, rational, old kind of liberal sensibilities to a shift in governing societies and understanding societies through their emotional and ethical quotient. And that's the attempt in my recent book that I make. If you even look at quickly the national education policy that many people are going gaga on, the opening statement of the document says that education is not all about critical qualities and cognitive abilities, but education is also values, emotional dispositions, everyday ethics, and therefore it is about character building, personality building, and which is connected to nation building. So this is a very, very big question that once this dam has broken open, how do we now manage this age of emotions? If we do not have that kind of a liberal option, and Martha Nussbaum cautions us in her book in the opening statement that if you allow state to begin to regulate and legislate on your values, on your ethics, and it gives sanctions to private emotions, then in all probability those states will turn authoritarian, which is probably what we are witnessing. But having critiqued, what do we do about it? That's the question. That do we then make a pitch again for old kind of liberal states where we push back emotions and ethics back into the private domain? And my own understanding has been that we perhaps cannot do that. That states are being evaluated through ethical and emotional quotient, and I see that there's partly also happened through social democracy. I don't have the time to explain those details, but those of you interested should take a look at the special issue of Outlook that I edited, which Snigdhendu has also contributed. Perhaps he will tell you a little more about that special issue when he speaks. That we did, I edited guest edited a special issue of Outlook where we did look at what the right-wing populist authoritarians do apart from the fact that they raise this kind of hysteria and confessional majoritarian Islamophobic mobilization, there's a lot more that happens why these populist authoritarians get their legitimacy from. They get their legitimacy because they draw on civilizational ethics, on cultural codes, on memory, on everyday ethics, on ideas of popular morals in societies that they draw from mythologies, myths, legends, popular culture, so on and so forth. There's a large repertoire of new variables and sensibilities that populist authoritarians have pushed into the public domain, and I don't think there's anytime soon we are getting back to the old kind of secular pure constitutional imagination. I think we'll have to deal with this in your face emotions and give them. And the question, therefore, I raise at the end of my book on politics, ethics, and emotions is that perhaps it's a time we raise an alternative questions that does it necessarily mean that political mobilizations can only be attuned to negative emotions of anger, hatred, fear, anxiety, and so on and so forth? Or is it possible to reimagine statecrafts, reimagine political legitimacy, reimagine political mobilization through positive human emotions of care, compassion, love, altruism, co-responsibility? I think the last person we knew who did this experiment was Gandhi in the Indian context, that his entire model of satyagraha, his entire model of political mobilization was indeed based on this kind of a politicization of deeply internal, intimate, personal ethics, which he thought is the best guarantee against soulless state overreach. I think I've already. How am I doing on time? I did not keep time as to when did we start. I think I've already spoken. I have a couple of other reasons, but I can hold my horses and I can stop here and hand it over to Snigdhendu.
No, you can conclude if you want for another.
If I can conclude,
yeah.
Okay,
that's
then
fine.
I can
That's
take
fine.
just couple of. Huh?
Yeah, please go ahead, sir.
Okay, so I'll just take about a couple of 3 or 4 minutes. So those were my three broad reasons in terms of first, cosmopolitanism and somewhere culture. What do we do? Second question is this anomaly between social democratization and growing economic inequalities. And the third is in terms of the age of emotions. And my last reasoning, which I call the problem of valuation, is a deep crisis in that modernity itself has pushed. That is in terms of proliferating social differentiation. No broad understanding in modernity is that more and more proliferation of differences would mean less centralization of social and economic and political power, which by default means more equality, more civility, more equalization. So that's the broad assumption of modernity, and therefore it allows more and more differences to proliferate. So part of that logic might be true, but the problem, on the other hand, the flip side of this problem of social differentiation, proliferation of social differentiation, is problem of what I call the problem of valuation. That is, once you have so many identities breaking down, then you do not have a vantage point to understand the nature of hierarchies between these identities. So to explain a much simpler way through examples is that earlier discourse, for instance, on caste had the Brahmin, non-Brahmin vantage point, which had a very clear hierarchy that Brahmins are the dominant position and the non-Brahmins are those who are resisting it. We had the Brahmin, Shudra or the Brahmin, Dalit conflict, which was also very clear in terms of its hierarchies, who stands where, what we need to resist. But today, look at caste question, that you have such proliferation of differences within subcaste, you have proliferation of differences within OBC, so on and so forth. Then imagine adding that up in terms of differentiation within Muslims, in terms of Pasmanda Muslims, Ashrafis, those caste and class differences. Then you have gender differences. So what eventually is happening with this differentiation is that we really do not have a political or an ethical way of evaluating where these groups stand vis-a-vis each other in terms of social hierarchies. For instance, how do you compare an OBC man with a Muslim woman, who is to be thought to be where one stands within hierarchy. For instance, where does a Muslim man stand vis-a-vis a Dalit woman? So I don't think we have any clear. No, Dalits would argue that it is untouchability that is the premier. Therefore, they would stand more, stand to be greater victims, while a Muslim might say that they are being persecuted in the current context, and therefore, this heightened sense of these hierarchies cannot have certain vantage point of analysis. What it is adding to is a heightened perception of victimhood. Therefore, each social group feels that it is the victim, and it is being the most victimized social group in the current political context. If you talk to OBCs, they would say that Congress has always given preference to Muslims and Dalits. OBCs have always stood out. They were the excluded lot, and therefore most OBCs would feel one of the reasons why large sections of OBCs have shifted to BJP is with this perception of real victim. If you talk to even upper caste, they would say that the majority of upper castes are very poor. This EWS scheme draws from that. So I can give any number of examples, but a deep sense of victimhood that has gripped us in a modernist context is something to do with proliferation of identities and our inability to hierarchically see which groups comes where it stands in hierarchy. And therefore, each group can kind of self-ascribe itself a certain victimhood positions. And partly, I think that is also the reason why what we are calling perceptions have come to dominate modern democracies, unlike rational. And therefore, data and evidence barely speak to this reality. Therefore, I think this demand of caste census, hopefully, we have to wait and see that how this debate on caste census, if at all we go in for caste census, will it settle this problem of valuation? So I would argue that these are the four reasons, I would argue, why societies are increasingly becoming, not only in India, but globally, illiberal, and there's a turn to authoritarian governance. So my larger pitch would be, even if one agrees that this illiberalism and authoritarianism is eventually dangerous to open societies, to modern democracies, a moral and political critique perhaps is not sufficient. And it is part of the liberal elites' constitutional vision that they simply run and rerun this critique that it's all illiberal and it's all authoritarian, without actually fundamentally getting into the reasons. Because many of these liberals who are critical of growing illiberality are libertarian. They support neoliberalism. They support market fundamentalism. So there is a lot of anomaly that's happening in our political position. And therefore, my plea would be, since you are a discussion forum wanting to open up new avenues, is that we need to dig behind right-wing authoritarianism, dig into these four reasons and see how we way that we can pull them back into a more social democratic setup rather than democracy. So I will stop there and thank once again for this opportunity.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Ajay, for your wonderful exposition of most important liberalism, illiberalism as not watertight compartments, the way in which they act and interact upon one another. And really, we are unable to identify what is liberal and what is illiberal in the sense of competing ideologies and identifications, as well as one's inability to focus on his own state of affairs in the society like India is a very wonderful exposition. Thanks a lot. And hopefully a lot of people may be asking questions. Our second speaker is Snigdhendu Bhattacharya. In fact, he only asked me just to say, Mr. Gagarin, you say, Mr. Snigdhendu is an independent journalist and author. That is sufficient. But still, I think I have to introduce a bit more, because recently only I have read about his articles and wonderful explicatory notes he has given Outlook magazine. Snigdhenduji is writing on politics, history, international relations, human rights, environment, and climate change. He has been publishing in The Diplomat, Outlook, The Wire, Nikkei Asia, Mongabe, Caravan, The Times of India, Hindustan Times, News Laundry, Article 14, Live History India, and India Spent, among others. He has two books published by Harper Collins India. One is Mission Bengal, a saffron experiment that was released in 2020. And the second book is Lalgar and the Legend of Krishnaji, Tales from India's Maoist Movement. That preceded this saffron experiment in 2016. It's good to have such a humble but scholarly as our panelist. Sir Snigdhendu sir, please.
I think we should also add Gagarinji that he has Snigdhendu won an award for one of his books. I don't know which one Snigdhendu. Was it the Kishanji one or the previous one?
I don't
the
know.
last one.
The last one. He got an award, state award in West Bengal.
The book on
Okay,
Hindustan.
great.
So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak. And it was really quite an experience to go through Professor Gudavarthy's book, and it was a really provoking work. I wrote about it, but then I still thought about some of the questions that he raised there, and about them in later also. And uh, coming to the subject of today's discussion, when you ask, is India becoming illiberal? We need to also ask, was India ever liberal? So, uh, I mean, I'm trying to figure out if from what our 19th century writers uh, saw or understood about India. And when I'm looking at the writings of Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who is often considered one of the founding fathers of Hindu nationalism, brand of exclusionary politics, then I'm clearly seeing that Bankim Chandra Chatterjee is writing that British rule in India is more beneficial to the majority of the masses than Brahminical rule. And he even mentions the word Ramrajya. He says that, yes, we are seeing discrimination in European rule, but there was greater discrimination under Brahminical rule. And he is writing this in 1870s. And at the same time, a decade before, in 1860s, Jyotiba Phule and Savitribai Phule in Maharashtra were telling the same thing to the children whom they were teaching in their schools. And this is one of the point perspective from which the Phules, they refused to consider the Maratha Empire as something for them to take pride on, for the Dalits to take pride on. So this caste discrimination, this caste discrimination, which has been so inherent in the Indian system for around 2000 years or so, that has this kind of the existence of such kind of a discrimination made India any liberal nation in the past at any point of time. Now, there might have been phases when there was a benevolent ruler in some part of the country. Not all part of the country was ruled by the same dynasty at the same time. So there might have been phases of a benevolent ruler. But what about the society? We had reformers like Chaitanya Dev or Ramdas or Dr. Dadu, who tried to reduce these inherent animosities in the society. They fought it. They fought a hard battle. But what was the society at large? It was inherently a discriminatory society. And now, how do we look at this in the modern times when there is a rise of the right wing? I understand it in the way that the right always thrives on discrimination. They always thrives on insecurity. And the right always tries to bring out the worst in human beings. So there is a devil in all of us. We try to fight it. Our spiritual leaders, they asked us to fight it. Even communist leaders asked people to fight the devil inside us. But the right wing, they always encourage people and incite people to let out the devil. So we are seeing a rise of a time when people are willingly letting out the devil. And but the question now that we come to is, why are we in such a time when such right-wing politics, discriminatory politics, and politics of intolerance and illogic, uh, they are gaining popularity around the world. It's not just India. So we know, I mean, I don't need to get into that history or anything like that. So what I am more of a journalist who learns more from speaking to people than from books. And because I have to travel for my profession most of the time, quite a lot, and speak to a lot of people, interview a lot of people. So, what the essence of the today's problems, the essence of the time which the right is managing to capitalize on is the extreme victory or triumph of capitalism with consumerism as its basic agenda. Now, on the one hand, we have seen an unprecedented amassing of wealth and in the hands of a handful. And there is a vast majority of population who have been thrown insecurity, into utmost insecurity about their daily lives, about their future, about medical expenses, about educational expenses, everything. People are under stress. At the same time, when these people are really under economic stress and finding it difficult to stay afloat, they are also being encouraged to spend more. This consumerism is making this problem all the more difficult because a person who is already finding it difficult to find his regular his necessity requirements is now also under peer pressure to buy things that he or she does not need. But since spending determines a person's identity in the society, they are under immense pressure. And the transformation of into informal sector, this has triggered further insecurity. So we have a population which is largely insecure and anxious and restless. And these kinds of people are always susceptible to to provocations, and this is what exactly happening right here now. I mean, if we look at the issue of migration, the global rise of the right in the Europe, it's not global, at least in the Europe, is essentially linked to the migration. And if we look at the issue of migration, who are to be blamed for this migration into Europe in the first place? It is again these Westerners, these Europeans. I mean, who bombed Iraq and why? And how was Iraq's oil industry, Iraq's oil petroleum resources linked to the bombing of Iraq? And was the bombing of Iraq related to really Saddam Hussein owning some weapon or American construction companies needing a new place to build roads and buildings? We are not looking at history. So I would say illiberalism is that state of mind when we don't see logically, we blindly follow, we try to find a shortcut, We try to find an easy scapegoat. We try to find an easy way to blame someone. So this blaming people for their own failures or their own situations or is a basic part of a normal human characteristics. Everybody wants to blame someone else when something happens that he or she did not want to happen. So these tendencies, these worst tendencies as human beings, they are being provoked and brought out in the public. Now, one simple example, I'll just say, in the recently, I think just ahead of the last week, there was certain price rise in the market, and tomato price had really skyrocketed, even ginger. And there were multiple reasons related to this rise in tomato prices and some other veggies also. In a market in Kolkata, when I asked a lady vegetable seller, so when is your price going to come down? It's pinching so much in my pockets. And she nonchalantly says, let the Eid go. Muslims are going to have a feast now, and so Hindus will have to suffer. Now, there is no way that Hindu-Muslim equation can come into this answer. We all know that prices peak during festive seasons, whether it's Durga Puja or Navratri or Kali Puja, what, or Christmas. It's a very usual thing. Now, why would you certainly blame Muslims for a price rise? It is because it gives you an easy way to vent out. Whom else will you vent out against? If you want to vent out against the government, it's a strong entity. You can't subjugate the government. Uh, I mean, it's like the man. We all know this analogy. When a man who gets harassed by his boss in the office comes home and vents it out on his child or wife. Here, the majority Hindus have found an easy scapegoat on the Muslims. This because they have fallen in the trap of this a devilish ideology that thrives on discrimination. So the question is that we are trying to understand the problem, but what is the solution? How can we move ahead and take it head on? To my understanding, there must be temporary, short-term goals, long-term goals, temporary solutions, and permanent solutions. No solution is permanent though. But if we look at the long-term perspective, the only way we can get out of this toxic environment is by opposing capitalism, the capitalist concentration of wealth, and by opposing consumerism by our lives. We have to practice. We have to practice not falling in the consumerist trap of mandatory spending, of spending under peer pressure. We have to be aware. We have to be conscious. If we have to fight the rise of illiberalism, we have to first ourselves start thinking and behave liberally and logically and decide what to buy and what not to, what to run after and what not to. So, and especially in the Indian context, I think it is all the more essential because we have been rewarded or awarded with, we have inherited the anti-materialist spiritual ideologies of our forefathers like Rabindranath Tagore or Lalan Fakir, the Sufi saints, who have protested discrimination and who have at the same time warned us against running after too much of material wealth. I mean, we all need material wealth. It is because of the immoral concentration of wealth, immoral taking away of wealth. Just look at this recent this recent development of the new coastal regulatory zone. The government has changed the rules related to coastal regulatory zones. And this has been going on for quite a long time. Successive governments have done it, but this time it's quite a rude shock. Now, what is this impact? That the boat owners, the traditional fishermen of India, stretching from Bengal to Andhra and Tamil Nadu and Kerala, these people, these who used to own their own boats, who used to be boat owners, are now workers in trawlers. There is there is a visible angst and frustration among them, among the fishing community in India's coastal belt, when you speak to them because of what happened to them over the past 20-30 years, how their life has just changed because of the governmental policies. So, on the one hand, we need to oppose policies that help concentration of wealth. We need to encourage policies that look at redistribution of wealth. And at the same time, we need to tell people about the dangers of consumerism. So this is these are some of the things that I understand about the present time. And what I understand is that we need not leaders of the kind that are ruling now, because we need leaders who will not ask us to be competitive. We don't need strong leaders. We don't need masculine leaders. Toxic masculinity is the the ideal leader of today. Is the ideal characteristic of a leader. We don't need masculine leaders. We don't need leaders, because if we don't need leaders who will divert today's anger to just some other direction. We need leaders who will address anger. We need leaders who will help reduce anger. Because, say, if today's right is taken on by the left, who just divert today's anti-Muslim or anti-Dalit anger into an anti-capitalist or anti-rich anger, we will have the same people, same intolerant people, and these same intolerant people will become the basis for running yet another authoritarian government, which will maybe lead us to China or North Korea. So we don't need China or North Korea either. We don't need any this kind of authoritarianism in any spectrum. So if a political leadership can't deal with the question of anger, in the civil society can't deal with the question of anger, the restlessness of the masses, then there is every possibility that one authoritarian regime will be overcome by another. It will be turned down. It will be pulled down by some another regime, which will again emerge authoritarian. So this is what I understand. And now I don't want to elongate my discussion, and so I would like to get into I have a few questions to ask Mr. Professor Gudavarthy, and so we would like to get in the discussion mode.
Yes, so we, Snigdhendu can maybe pose those questions, and we can
Yeah,
begin
you
with
would like
the
to pose
discussion
certain
with.
questions.
Yeah,
So
we can begin with discussion
yeah,
with Snigdhendu and then follow it up with the Q&A.
So one question I would like to ask is, in your book you wrote, in today's world, the right is justifiably mobilizing emotions and striking a chord with the majority. But that is necessarily illiberal. But that is necessarily illiberal in nature and producing ethics that are blatantly majoritarian. You wrote this, and another place you wrote, do everyday ethics and emotions necessarily approve of all that the right does in the name of family, religion, and nation? Or is that the right strikes a chord momentarily and then begins to structure and force it into a greed, from where there is no escape, even if the majority does not condone the violence and illiberality of the right. And then you also give an answer, a short answer, that in order to in order to fight this, we need to make a distinction on the one hand between morality and ethics, and on the other between pragmatism and emotion. So this separatism, which you said it is not easy but necessary, I would like you to elaborate a little more on this separation of these aspects.
No, that I feel is the key to the process. Yeah, Snigdhendu, go ahead. You want to say something?
Yeah. Just this separation. How do we separate this morality and ethics and pragmatism and emotion? How do we practice it?
Yeah, so I think we need to, it's important to get into the processes. Often that we have a very structured understanding that that there is a kind of a structured consent to illiberality, and it is here to stay. But I don't see India is a too large a place, too diverse a place, and the way right, if one keeps a close watch, is actually growing. Is by drawing a consent, by drawing on people's latent emotions and everyday ethics, that wherever their ethics kind of consent, and those ethics are based on our popular understanding, what I call the cultural codes in the cultural sociology literature, which is based on our popular understanding of myths, mythologies, legend, our memory, therefore good and bad, sacred and profane. These kinds of distinctions they draw, and therefore wherever people think right is fighting those things, that is when people lend their consent. Wherever it does not, I think people also withdraw the consent. Therefore, we'll have to see this process as very much open-ended. And but what the right does is that, therefore, my larger argument, Snigdhendu, is that people might be consenting to the regime not necessarily exclusively only because they support authoritarianism, because of Islamophobia, hatred of Muslims, or support of authoritarianism. That might be a team, but there might be a much larger process why people are consenting. People are consenting because the regime is able to successfully deliver the optics of a deep sense of belonging, a deep sense of allowing us to express our cultural selves, which is very historical, which is very civilizational, which is expressed in our rituals, in the spectacles that they do in terms of, the Hindu rituals, Hindu spectacles, temple building, all of that which happens. I think that is what resonates with people, and people may not see it necessarily in terms of an exclusionary, majoritarian religiosity, but might see it as an everyday religious form being celebrated, which allows us to express our cultural selves. So that is when I think the consent is led. But the regime might turn that everyday ethics into a structured morality. That's why in the introduction, if you have seen, I make a distinction between ethics and morality. Morality is something that is structured, that has an eternal notion of right and wrong, that is based on hierarchy, that is structured forever. But people's ethics, I don't think, work like that. Simply pragmatic living conditions do not allow people to have absolutist imagination of what is morally right and wrong. They contextually define what is morally right, what should be done, what should not be done, which keeps wavering. Therefore, they might at certain places condone violence, but at certain places they take very, they condone certain majoritarian, but there are certain places where they are very compassionate. Look at Delhi riots. All ethnographic accounts of Delhi riots say that Hindus invariably protected Muslims. So it is a structured pattern that you see. This is not a comparable case with the Third Reich. The Germans continue to love Hitler till the point it was brought down by the Allied forces. I don't see the process in India in those rather structured. Right is trying to do that, which is a different matter, but it is faltering. There is no homogenization. There is no, the right is struggling to build an hysteria. You often see that they get to a crescendo, but that all friends doesn't hold. If you look at Karnataka elections, the chief minister himself said that halal and hijab are not electoral issues. because he could see that people stop responding to it. So people that respond to certain issues in a very hyper-pitched manner in certain contexts stop responding in other contexts. So we are working in a very complex modern context and modern matrix where multiple variables operate. Therefore, my plea is therefore to look at the process in a more concrete way rather than through this broad brush, very generic understanding. There's rise of illiberalism and Islamophobia, everything is moving towards fascism. Well, politically that rhetoric might be useful to put certain pressure on the regime, but that will not explain us how to generate counter narratives that will speak to the people. Therefore, the counter narratives have to understand this matrix, when and why people lend their consent and when and why people withdraw their consent. Both are happening. Look at Karnataka. Even coastal Karnataka this time voted out the BJP. Why? How do you expect? Tomorrow UP might vote out, for all we know. So people are very open-ended. They're evaluating through everyday consent, through everyday ethics and latent emotions, and we need to keep a tab on that. That was the purpose of that those paras you read out.
In fact, some audience posed questions. One Sanjana raised a question. This is Professor Gudavarthy, she told. Gandhi did bring, you can see this in the chat box, sir, Gudavarthy, sir.
Yeah, I opened Gagarinji.
Gandhi did bring in positive emotions into politics while addressing questions of social justice, but he addressed the different groups differently. Do you think then that there needs to be differential emotions? There needs to be differential emotions that take into account the locationality of groups and address them differently while simultaneously arguing for universal ethics.
No, I think this is a good question, and one needs to think deeper on this in terms of what the Gandhian experiment was. So, to begin with, I think it is right to say that Gandhi did acknowledge differential caste and religious groups. He did give legitimacy. That's very interesting. If you read a very recent piece by Akhil Bilgrami, where he talks about this process of why Gandhi supported Varna system. And he says that Gandhi supported Varna system not because it is discriminatory, not that he did not see the discriminatory, but he said that Varna is an antidote to modern alienation. That modern liberalism tries to bring equality by building, homogenizing us all into citizenship or through market and modernity. But he says Varna allows us to protect our cultural selves, and therefore this protection of cultural selves is an antidote to modernist alienation and individualism. And therefore Gandhi's overall emphasis was, how do we then fight inequalities, hierarchies in caste from within the tradition, from within the culture, rather than depend on modern liberal state apparatus and modern market. So that's the question. So therefore, Bilgrami says Gandhi was not supporting Varna in terms of its hierarchy and discrimination, but in terms of its cultural differences and the need to protect diversity, cultural diversity. He felt was important to avoid liberal homogenization and modern alienation and individuation. So if I take that as my starting point to address Sanjana's question. So Gandhi was a champion of protecting cultural selves. He saw that culture therefore has to be understood not merely in this modernist take of whether it is conservative and so on and so forth, but that culture also has deep roots, possibilities to generate a notion of solidarity. Like all, so no point that even Snigdhendu was referring to, the entire Sufi Bhakti tradition that we had, it demonstrated that religion and religious practices themselves have enough space for critique of religious fanaticism. That, only yesterday I went out to watch a play on Kabir, and this entire Kabir tradition of questioning institutionalized religion. He questioned both masjid and mandir. He questioned ritualistic as against spirituality, so on and so forth. So we have India very long tradition of this kind of counter ethics, what we can refer to as counter publics. Therefore, to address Sanjana's question, I think we will have to tap into those cultural codes and ethics and then see that how do we equate these differences in terms of differential caste, cultural locations. Where would the fault line between difference and universality lie? I think that is the greatest conceptual question of our modern times, that we have this increasing globalization, commonality, marketization, which is pushing one kind of equalization. But that universalization should not lead to homogenization. So how do we have heterogeneity and equality? That is the question. I think it's a deep crisis, which is what is leading to the rise of the right. That right draws on this anxiety of homogenization that modernity brings and pushes in hierarchy. What left does is that it fights hierarchy, but the progressive forces undermine heterogeneity and push a homogenized secular identity. But our new question that if we pick up some clues from the right is that how do we give enough space for cultural diversity, cultural lifestyle, widening cultural values, yet push for a more universal ethic. So Gandhi would be a good starting point. May not be able to address all the complexities that what we feel here. And therefore, I think the key question is this: where do we draw that line between difference and universality, between recognition and prejudice? I think is an important question. So your question remains important. We need to think through. Gandhi gives us initial clues. I am not able to completely answer whether we can have differential emotions. Is that the way to go about to arrive at universal things? I'm not very sure. I need to further reflect on this before I can answer it.
Thank you, sir. This is with reference to Dr. Ajay's assertion, identity politics of caste and many other primordial loyalties versus identification with a religious culture and civilizational idea. How far the material deprivation is offset by the religio-cultural emotional succor. How quickly this euphoric bubble will burst in your assessment, making people understand that they should focus on material and spiritual development?
No, I don't agree with the way this question is.
Connection problem is there, I think.
Yeah, I think my connection is becoming wobbly.
Yeah.
So to go back, so I don't agree with the way this question is posed. That the problem that I was trying to address is partly present in the way the question is being formulated. That to see religion and culture, civilization as being problematic, and therefore we need to give precedence to material issues as against. No, that's not the either or choice. That's not a dichotomous choice that we need to make. That's the kind of a thinking that we go into, which gives space to right. I think religion has its own place, culture has its own place, materiality has its own place. We need to see both as co-primary, not trade off one against other. Not to right does this, gives entire culture into material, and broadly left does the other thing. Things that redistributive material thing will kind of settle all questions of culture and spirituality. No, I think human beings, we need both. We need spiritual, we need cultural identity, we need sense of belonging, we need recognition, we need dignity. These are all cultural questions. They are important in themselves as an end. And then you have material questions, material deprivation, poverty, inequality, the economic deprivation. So one translates into another. There is an complex interface between how, for instance, caste, cultural, material. It is both. It is the cultural deprivation which leads to material deprivation, and material deprivation reinforces cultural indignities. So I think we need to reframe. That's precisely my part of the thrust of my presentation was that what right is doing is what you're suggesting, that it is kind of projecting religion in lieu of everything else. So it partly succeeds because there is no other social political force in India today which talks in the language of cultural mobilization. It's only the RSS which does that. So obviously they have a free play. It's a field, so they are kicking goals after goals. And because we need to then get into those spaces where we'll have to also mobilize religion, educational institutions, family, neighborhood, interpersonal relations. Liberalism, liberal modernity did not allow us any political say in all of these spaces. We just left it free. And the RSS declared itself cultural organization, mobilized, and therefore it projected its religion and materiality as alternative. I think both need to go together. We need to produce a cultural selves. that, as I pointed out in my anomaly between social democratization. And that's what modern democracies did. That social democratization has been produced, but economic inequality is gone. That's partly the reason to cope with that. That you're told you're dignified, but you don't have a dignified life. In order to cope, people have to cope it through aggression, externalization, all this, what Indian was also explaining, the sadism, anger against Muslims. They have to have a process of transference of all that to somebody else to protect their own, self-imagination, self-illusion that they have a dignified life. So what the right wing does precisely is that it keeps drilling. So this all hyperbolism about our civilization, about our ancient history, Vishwaguru, all this fills that space. That you have an undignified economic life and you have this super massist imagination of your cultural self. This is the anomaly that is helping. I think therefore we have to fight that anomaly through a social democratic welfare state, give everyone certain level playing field in terms of, therefore I'm a big time champion of universal education and universal healthcare and universal basic income. I think these are the three big demands that all social democratic non-right parties from left to Congress to regional parties need to push in, so that you have a certain level playing field and then a cultural discourse. Then culture will begin to behave itself. Culture today is behaving so badly because you have such anomaly. Then you cannot ask people. Therefore, people can only see culture in this hyperbolic and supermass systems. If you give them a level playing field, then we can dig into the notions of solidarity within culture. Today, what is happening is that because culture behaves like this, modernist, progressive, left forces think culture is only about exclusion, culture is only about prejudice, culture is only about supermassist belief. No, culture also has deep sense of solidarity. Look at Bhakti movement. I mean, they talk about religion. He is all about universal human being, universal compassion. Therefore, we need to dig into those discourses. We cannot brush aside entire culture just because culture is not behaving the registers we want it to behave, because there are reasons why it is behaving the way it's behaving. So we have to readjust this entire matrix. Right has succeeded our frame. It has really, it's on the jigsaw puzzle. It has pushed in different ways. Now we need to rearrange that puzzle in a manner where it can attune to the kind of politics many of us here would want to see in times to come.
Okay, sir. Thanks a lot. Snigdhendu sir, would you like to chip in, or we'll go to the next
Yeah,
question?
I will just I would just like to add one thing. I
Please,
mean,
sir.
this question of superiority, getting glory in our ancient civilization, be proud of our ancient civilization. If we look at this Hindu nationalist historiography, how this Hindu nationalist brand of Indian history came into being, then we will see the root cause of it. The root of it is the colonization of India. In the 19th century, the birth of Hindutva or Hindu nationalist historiography took place in Bengal, where the advancement of European liberalism had led to the birth of the Bengal Renaissance. We had figures like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who were targeting the old Hindu practice, who launched scathing attacks in the on the Hindu society, on the discriminatory nature of Hindu society, and uh, the kind of illogical thinking that dominated the Hindu society. And as a reaction to this liberalism of the Bengal Renaissance, of Ram Mohan Roy and other progressive figures, and to fight the question, to answer the question that how we became such a colonized race. This is where, from the present, to divert attention from the present state of peril, they started looking at ancient. They started telling that maybe we are today colonized, maybe we are today ruled by either Muslims or the British, but thousands of years ago we ruled the world. And this is what this. If we look at the G20 meeting and the booklet that the government released on the G20 for the G20 countries, the official booklet that the government has released, it says that India's civilization, Vedic civilization, started 6,000 years ago. This is rubbish. I mean, I mean, you have listened to Professor Thapar, you have read Professor Habib, and there are so many other historians of world repute around the world who will rubbish it. There is no way of Vedic civilization becoming 6,000 years old, but they are claiming it. Why? To divert people's attention from today's economic loot to some ancient imaginary glory. They are telling that India was the Vishwaguru, India taught civilization to the world, and we have to become that leader again. No, India never was that leader who taught civilization to the world. No country in the world taught civilization to the whole world. Every world, every country, every land had its own history. There were cultural exchanges, each learned from the other, but no one was superior to the other. This entire context of superiority has been brought up to divert attention from the real inferiority that today's people face because of the economic disadvantage and because of the planned loot of India's natural wealth and common wealth that is being planned.
Okay. Okay, sir. Thanks a lot. Another question is, could you please explain what neoliberalism implies in the context of Indian democracy? Both Dr. Ajay and Snigdhen. Dr. Ajay, sir, you are
Go
there?
ahead. I'm there, but Snigdhen, do you want to go ahead on that first?
No, you first.
No, so the neoliberalism, has been, as many of us know, post Washington Consensus, post 1990s, India took a neoliberal turn. If you begin with post-independence period with Nehruvian Consensus, India had a relative autonomy of the state that was attempting to manage industry, agriculture, so on and so forth. But post 90s, we moved towards an open economy, open market. There is what people writing on like David Harvey, neoliberalism, and Michael Sandel referred to as market fundamentalism, that every aspect of social life today is defined in terms of market value. So market and the contract in the market becomes the parameter to gauge social valuation. So this problem of valuation that I tried to discuss at the end of my talk as my fourth reason, that's where market seeps in. We try to value everything in these monetarized terms. We try to value cultural selves in terms of consumption patterns, which is very, very dangerous because market is, in the sense, inherent and aggressive institution of accumulation. It's oriented towards profit. And this big question that can ethical question, Michael Sandel raises this question in The Limits of Market, where can all ethical questions be settled through market equalization? And therefore, neoliberalism does this great damage. The most visible damage we can see in the Indian social life is in terms of commercialization of education. Those of us coming from Andhra and Telangana in the south, we have clearly seen what this commercialization of education has done. Every public representative owns innumerable medical and engineering colleges which give poor education, capitation fee. Then people make money because they have to invest so much to get that degree. Then they think that their immediate aim is to reap that money. So last year in Telangana, we had this huge crisis of junior doctors when they were told that in their probationary period, they need to serve in rural areas. They revolted. They said, we have paid such huge capitation fees to get these medical degrees. Now you ask us to go and serve in rural areas where we no payment. Why should we do it? And which is a fair question from their vantage point. Therefore, the problem is not their question. The problem is to commercialize health and education in such a crass manner. And then, you have the caste Hindus talking about merit, where most of caste Hindus get their education through capitation fee. Then they feel reservation is a problem. So it builds an entire worldview. This whole marketization builds an entire worldview, which leads to aggression and a certain consent to also political violence, I would say. So there are these large, interconnections which one has to develop. So in that sense, I would say neoliberalism and right-wing populism go hand in hand together. And therefore, to break that, we need to have a social democratic setup. Therefore, when Bharat Jodo Yatra happened, one was happy with this whole message of love and relief. But my complaint was that it should have brought in a social democratic imagination. It should have promised people large-scale welfare policies, not this transactional welfareism of free bus pass, women can travel in public transport. All this is fine, but I think time has come for what I refer to as the third democratic upsurge, that we need to have complete KG to PG, as we say in Telangana, free education, common public school system, and we need to have complete health as a public good and some basic income scheme as a starting point to have a basic social democratic setup whereby democracy can function. There are deep links between democracy and neoliberalism in this sense.
Yeah, thanks a lot, sir. I think the same related to this. We define liberalism and liberalism, illiberalism. How is it different from neoliberalism in economics? I think that you have already explained. Can the difference be overcome to build discourse based on the basic values of certain human rights? Of course, that also I think your answer says. Snigdhendu sir, would you like to say something on this?
No, I will just support what Professor Gudavarthy just said, that neoliberalism goes hand in hand with this. And I would just say in one sentence that freedom or free trade or free whatever in an unequal society is never fair. So so-called free trade is never free because people don't have equal resources. People don't have equal power. So you always need to have protection against the dominant. And neoliberalism takes away that protection. It tells the poorest of the poor to compete with the richest of the rich, which is absurd, which will always lead to social anxiety. And I will again support Professor Gudavarthy's point that it is one of our starting points against this can be demands like universal healthcare, universal education, to calm the population down, to let us live with less anxiety.
Okay, sir. Thank you. And next question is, it is Dr. Gudavarthy raised, aggression is a necessary tool for the people's voice to be heard. That is what the present generation is thinking. Is it because of the failure of the state to attend to public needs of hunger, health, education, etc., sir?
Yeah, so that's part of the reason, but then that's also because state is very consciously mobilizing on those measures. This anomaly that exists, state is creating a new aspirational self. This whole Atmanirbhar, you can achieve sky, start startups, and then you can become rich overnight. This whole idea of Chandrayaan, we can occupy the moon, we can occupy the sun, we are the Vishwa Gurus. So this entire hyperbolic imagination is being presented, which is very, very aspirational, futuristic, and so on and so forth. And then you are pushing an economic model of neoliberalism where people do not have even basic amenities. If you go to places like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, where these experiments are succeeding in a big rate, you do not have basic primary healthcare system. You do not have doctors. You do not have basic income and basic economic support systems to even approach basic health and education. So this anomaly is what is creating aggressions. How do people then compensate? You tell people you are, you belong to a great civilization, you are the leader of the world. And then when you turn to your life, the everyday indignity and incivility and basic struggle you have for basic existence. So this anomaly is what is in one sense creating the need. It's a coping technique for many social groups to draw some kind of inequivalence between the material indignity of their material deprivation and hyperbolic imagination, which partly emerged from social democratization that has happened in the last 30-40 years. So I think we'll have to hit out, and therefore right-wing populism, what it does is that it is conscious of this anomaly and it keeps on legitimizing this aggression in the name of religion, in the name of civilization, in the name of history, in the name of partition, in the name of Vishwa Guru. It might have 100 other things, but what it does is that it justifies this aggression as a necessary correction to some historical injury. It could be religious, it could be colonialism, it could be 1200 years of colonial rule, whatever it might be. But what it does in the end is it does two things. It justifies aggression and it justifies differential treatment. It justifies that some people shall be treated differently from others. It might begin with Hindu-Muslim, that it might begin to say that Muslims are secondary citizen and Hindus, but it does not stop there. This is wheels within the wheels, and within Hindus, there will be differential treatment. Within caste Hindus, there will be differential treatment. Within political elites, there will be differential treatment. So the entire ethic is about justifying differential treatment and aggression.
So basically, it will be a cascading effect.
Cascading, yes, that's what it is. That's what is happening. You cannot simply explain some of the social behavioral patterns that we are observing. Even deep south, when I did surveys, Mr. Gagarin Garu, in Shadnagar, in my own village, people, after Article 370 being abrogated, they're using such hyperbolic language that, now India should strike, and India has its a point that we have arrived, deep south, I've never heard such a thing. But then one realizes that this has a cascading, because it's not about only Hindu-Muslim. It then unconsciously we begin to justify hierarchical and differential treatment. We think that is the legitimate way to get what is due to you. So that whole framework of rule of law, social equality, mutuality, all that gets displaced. And then it becomes wheel within wheel, that who is ill-treating whom, nobody knows. But everybody thinks that they need to get a preferential treatment over others. And that, I think, more or less now, which also feeds into neoliberalism, has become the modern social ethic in contemporary Indian democracy.
Yeah. Sir, Snigdhendu sir, would you like to say something?
No, he has just covered everything.
Okay. In fact, the last question that is related to Snigdhendu sir's assertion, British Raj is far more better than Brahmin Raj. That is what Bankim Chandra Chatterjee told, referring to the Brahminical societal structure wherein caste hierarchy, exploitation, vagera. Even though we agree with this or not agreeing, the question is, why don't our intellectual elite, including the Brahminical elite, realize this contradiction, if I want to say? Why do they cling on to this religious illusion so dearly?
No, I think it is quite this caste discrimination is so inherent in our society that one needs to constantly fight against it consciously, just like patriarchy. It's so deep-rooted around the world. In Indian context, this caste hierarchy, sense of caste hierarchy, caste superiority is so inherent. And even in our so-called liberal society, even among this civil society and intelligentsia, we can find this, we can trace this. And one of the examples I will again show how we need to take a re-look at our own history in the making of India. Because if we look at the incident of Bhima Koregaon, so why did a Mahar army help the British to defeat the Maratha? That is because the Bajirao's Maratha empire was an utterly Brahminical empire which thrived on the oppression of the Shudras, and therefore the Shudras had no connection, felt no connection with the Maratha empire. And this is one of the reasons India has suffered for 2000 years or so, 1500 years or so. And this is so deeply rooted inside us, like people carrying Brahminical surnames and upper caste surnames. I don't think there is enough initiative from these people who are used to living in a society of superiority, of hierarchy, of enjoying the benefits of being having inherited superior surname. That we don't try enough. We don't try enough, and we are not ready to leave our space. We are not ready to accommodate the others who have been trampled, who have been oppressed for thousands of years. we are not these upper caste, the Savarna people are more ready to give up their space to make way for the people who have not been allowed to speak. And that's one of the reasons India remains divided. Indian society remains a divided society.
Thanks a lot, sir. Dr. Ajay, would you like to add something?
No, what was the question?
See, the question is, Professor Snigdhendu told Bankim Chandra Chatterjee asserted that British Raj was better compared to the Brahmin Raj, wherein the mass of the people in India were exploited and on the basis of caste discriminated very badly. So we may agree, we may not agree. Of course, colonialism in any case we don't support. But why the Indian elite, including the Brahminical elite, is unable to identify this truth, and why they are not interested in making course corrections and hugging the illusion of religion so dearly?
No, that's what I think partly Snigdhendu said, that caste is a way of life for us, that these hierarchies are so internally justified that maybe much of our Brahminical elite does not have a disposition to look at self-critically, that how skewed social benefits have been, how much social power has been concentrated in such a tiny population. Even now, all statistics show the modern sector castes which are 3 to 4% in India have a presence of 70 to 80%, whether it's media, whether it's bureaucracy, whether it is judiciary. I think recent statistics are startling that Brahmins, their presence is disproportionate in all. That is one end of the question. But whether that but the last point that he makes, that they cling on to religious, that might be a bit of a misnomer, because this clinging on to the religious identity is not happening only at the Brahminical end. It is now happening also at the subaltern end. Look at the shift of Dalits and Bahujans to the BJP. 33% of Dalits and 42% of OBC in 2019 have voted for the BJP. Now RSS is conducting experiments of Shiv Charcha in UP. One of my students is doing his PhD, and it's essentially the OBCs and the tribals which are being mobilized in very big numbers through this idea of Shiv Charcha and idealization. So religion, I don't think, can immediately be linked to caste in that sense. Religion, people see religion, religious identity, religion as cultural selves, I think is a requirement of all castes. How it gets interpreted, how hierarchies might be reinforced through that is a different process. But religion is not a priority or prerogative only of a certain Brahminical caste. I think even lower end caste, so-called lower end caste, I think cling on to religion equally. And that is where, again, because of our secular understanding, we thought that religion is only about certain caste. But in my surveys in UP, every Dalit household I visit, there is Ambedkar's portrait on one end and Lord Ram's portrait on the other side of the wall. So these are not mutually exclusive identities. We thought that Dalit naturally meant being anti-Hindu and questioning, challenging Hindu. No, you can be Dalit for the purpose of representation and Hindu for the purpose of cultural recognition. So these equations that we did not understand is what I think the right wing has built. And therefore, we have to reframe some of these questions, even as we continue to mount our criticism against skewed Brahminical power in the Indian context.
Okay, sir. Thanks a lot. In fact, we thought of having this is the last question, but one gentleman posed a question. I thought it is important to answer him. Swaminathan Sai Ram, he raised a question. How could the ancient kings build great temples and pyramids? Certainly the Egyptian and Dravidian cultures had their greatness. Can we define what is liberalism and illiberalism, and how to draw a line between them in the light of the above statement? That is what he's...
No, Gagarin, you are confusing. That's a comment. That's a comment Swaminathan has made.
Okay.
And the second is a question. I'm basically asking, in the context of our discussion, what is liberalism, what is illiberalism, and how do we distinguish with reference to a particular policy?
Okay, I'm sorry. In fact, because both are together, I am afraid both are by the same question. Okay, okay.
So one is a comment, other is a.
Okay, okay. Basically, the question is, can we define what is liberalism and illiberalism and how to draw a line between them?
Yeah, so that's precisely the crisis of our times, you know, that we can't, whether we can make a distinction, and whether the deeper crisis would be whether a lot of illiberalism has actually emerged from liberal practices, because there is an inherent intolerance in liberalism itself. There is an inherent limitation in the liberal worldview that has this constitutional overreach, legal overreach onto cultural lifestyle. So these are very complex questions of our times, and that is a key question, that where do we draw that link between liberalism and illiberalism? Suffice it to say that I think certain forms of liberalism, you know, that for instance something like rule of law is a core liberal principle. So there we can make a very clear distinction between what is liberal and what is illiberal. But again, there's a complicated explanation today that in most democracies, rule of law is not part of popular imagination. You know, most people stand to take popular positions against rule of law. You know, to do justice, people think rule of law has to be violated, partly because of the way law works in Indian context. So, there are liberal values, liberal sensibilities, but much of those liberal values and sensibilities, because of liberalism's connection with capitalism, has been the repository of protecting certain interests of social elites. That's been the history of liberalism. And therefore, what we are seeing under populism is a certain resistance against liberalism, because that resistance is, in fact, one can read it as an anger against capitalism. And right-wing political mobilization is mobilizing that sensibility of anger against capitalism, growing inequalities and all of that, and converting it successfully into a certain kind of a legitimacy to illiberal practices. But people may not directly be wanting to have those kind of illiberal. So these are very complex matrix layered things that are happening at various points of time in history.
Thank you, sir. Snigdhendu sir, would you like to add something, or shall we finish?
No, I think he just explained it. I mean, it's not always separatable. I mean, so he explained it well, but just to be short on liberalism, I mean, the whole speech he has explained it quite well. To my understanding, it is the ability to, I mean, economic liberalism is different, political liberalism, social liberalism is different. So socio-political liberalism is the idea of living and letting others live, and logical thinking. And when you stop thinking logically and when you just blindly follow others, that I think leads to illiberalism.
Yeah.
But my explanation may be too easy, and it doesn't encompass the complexity of what he just explained. It's actually complex.
Correct. Okay. Thanks a lot, sir. In fact, we are highly thankful to you. Both of you have wonderfully explained the subject. Most important, many people actually accused us asking, you have to make your caption all right. The caption should be, is India increasingly becoming illiberal? That is what in fact, you also started your debate with, is India liberal in the first instance, in order to ask whether India is becoming illiberal. So that sort of questions also, even before the debate or discussion started, some such ideas came up. Very happy that many people responded well, even though some of the people accused us why you are bringing such type of topic and all, but still we are thankful to you, sir, both Dr. Ajay and Snigdhendu sir. And secondly, Ms. Shreya, who always designs our poster very innovatively. This time, Ms. Nayanthara did the job. You have seen that poster, how nice it is. We thank Dr. Nayanthara, and we thank our advisors who are leading us from brighter light to brighter light. And we also thank Anekdhara well-wishers. In fact, many of our well-wishers formed a separate group and forcing us to do something better and better. We thank them. And we thank our technical team under the headship of Mr. Sadiq. Next webinar on 29th October, we are hoping and wishing to organize on the reform movements in the 19th century, in which Mahatma Phule, Savitribai Phule, the great Ranade, Agarkar, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Pandit Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Swami Vivekananda, etc. played pioneering roles. So that is what next October webinar we are wishing, sir. And thanks a lot for your wonderful exposition of the subject.
Thank you. Thanks, Gagarin. Thanks to Sadiq and others for this lovely interaction. And thanks to Snigdhendu.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Snigdhendu. Wonderful having you, and nice exposition that you made. We were wondering how the topic would go on, but we simplified it, and there was a comment: it is all intellectual gyrations and nothing concrete is there. But then you made it much more concrete than what is thought about.
So in fact, one
Thank you.
Mr. Jaisimha Makineni also commented, the webinar is really excellent. It made us students of chaos theory. And from chaos to cohesion, I think we are moving, I think. Okay, sir. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Now, Snigdhendu, sir, and Dr. Ajay, sir.
Thank you.